This slide features three places: Chicago's Maxwell Street Market, the birthplace of the Chicago Blues; a map of São Paulo's Largo da Banana, or Banana Square, the origin of the urban São Paulo samba; and Austin's Armadillo World Headquarters, the countercultural music hall that helped give birth to the city's reputation as the, quote, live music capital of the world. The subsequent collection here offers contemporary views of the three same sites. The Largo da Banana, now a wide road, and Armadillo World Headquarters, now a parking lot, bear few traces of their pasts. The contrast is only slight along Maxwell Street. While 8 of the area's late 19th and early 20th century buildings were preserved and adaptively reused, the bustling street market and its reverberating rhythms are long absent. What factors led to the transformation of these globally significant sites of music history? I introduce these spaces and pose this question to students on the first day of my course, Mapping Urban Destruction, inviting them to begin a semester-long investigation of demolitions and urban spatial history through historical GIS, or HGIS. Mapping Urban Destruction combines seminar-style historical and geographical inquiry with labs centered on HGIS methodologies. In addition, we engage with the history of demolitions in the surrounding city and contribute original research to a collaborative digital historical mapping platform in São Paulo. In this pedagogy-centered presentation, I provide an overview of and critical reflections on this course. I address how an open environment of collaborative, critical inquiry positions students to excavate and visualize places no longer visible in contemporary landscapes, and to develop nuanced understandings of urban spatial change and continuity over time. Since 2019, I have taught 4 iterations of the course at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago, the University of North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and most recently at the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm assistant professor in the African and African Diaspora Studies department. I've structured each version as a comparative urban history focused on the 20th and 21st centuries, and most often on 2 cities: São Paulo, where my research is based, and the city where I was teaching the course at the time. For example, at Northwestern, we compared São Paulo and Chicago. This latter choice has allowed us to engage directly with and deepen our understanding of local histories of demolition, a central goal of the course. The most recent iteration took place in the spring of 26 at the University of Texas at Austin. Now, São Paulo and Austin make for a perhaps surprisingly auspicious comparison. High-level similarities between the 2 cities likely help. Both are capitals of populous states that have an outsized significance within their respective nations. Interior riverine cities where water has fundamentally shaped both their relationship to the surrounding region as well as their process of urbanization. Significant hubs for the settlement of freed people following the formal abolition of slavery in the 19th century, and anchored by prominent institutions of higher education. The cities also grew at a breakneck pace of population growth and redevelopment, albeit in substantially different periods that involved extensive demolitions. Indeed, this is a particularly meaningful time to study demolitions in Austin. This map shows the locations of approximately 14,000 permitted demolitions in the city from 2010 to 2025, which have contributed to the drastic transformation of the city's landscape. A 2022 article appraised the situation as follows, quote, "Austin's core is being pummeled," or as a member of Austin's Historic Landmark Commission recently remarked, "This is carnage, guys." Mapping Urban Destruction is divided into 3 sections. In the introductory section, we build an expansive working conception of this phenomenon, including by discussing canonical cases and contemporary local examples of demolition. One of the most proximate is pictured here: a wall adjacent to UT's campus featuring an iconic Austin mural that was recently spared during the demolition of the surrounding building. I encourage students to approach demolitions like these not as natural, neutral, or inevitable parts of change and growth, but as contingent acts produced through negotiations and contestations among individuals, ideologies, and institutions. I emphasize that demolitions can have complex, at times surprising dynamics and meanings, including ones that belie straightforward narratives, as well as lasting consequences. At the same time, the conditions and circumstances that lead to demolitions are frequently cloudy and sometimes characterized by dissimulation. The material disappearance of sites themselves can further inhibit our ability to uncover the causes, effects, and context surrounding demolitions. And this makes collaborative, open inquiry, as well as HGIS, all the more productive and necessary as methodologies. Following the introduction, the subsequent two sections of the course focus on each of the two cities, and they are subdivided by themes. In seminars, which take place once per week, these themes include an overview of the spatial history of each city, seminal redevelopment projects and the role of demolitions in them, the social history of demolition, including patterns of displacement and effective ties that people possess to demolished places, the relationship between preservation and demolition, and lastly, reconstruction, which here ranges from the reuse of materials taken from demolished sites to contemporary projects producing digital twins for cultural heritage. Now, in seminar-style inquiry framed by these three themes, we engage secondary literature, primary sources, and media focused both on case studies of singular demolitions as well as broad patterns relating to them. We investigate local manifestations of familiar patterns, such as how demolitions linked to mid-20th century urban renewal and highway construction throughout the U.S. transformed the local built environment and exacerbated sociospatial inequalities. We also encounter unexpected, even surprising dynamics. Reading a compelling ethnography from Alberto Goiânia, for instance, we learn about Brazilian demolition engineers who had a deep appreciation for the architectural significance of the buildings they were charged to destroy. Goiânia even documents examples of these engineers saving parts of the buildings they're demolishing and donating them to heritage institutions of their own volition. In seminar, students also engage critically with my research. They read an article about the demolition of São Paulo's former Church of the Remedies, the headquarters of Brazil's Underground Railroad in the 1880s, and a museum dedicated to the enslaved following formal abolition in 1888. They also view demos of an augmented reality project in development focused on the creation of narrative augmented reality experiences at the former site of the Remedies. Presenting my work in this way helps to further cultivate an environment of open and collaborative inquiry. Studying this church and museum also introduces students to the history of Brazilian heritage institutions. Negotiations about the fate of the Church of the Remedies took place amid the founding of Brazil's first national heritage body, the Serviço do Patrimônio Histórico Artístico Nacional. Local preservation authorities in São Paulo from this national body recommended the Church of the Remedies among just 8 sites in the region to receive federal protection. And this organization's first nationally circulated magazine included a lengthy feature article about the Remedies Church. Despite these efforts, however, city officials deemed the church as of, quote, debatable historical and artistic value and proceeded with demolition. Such cases help students to see the contingent processes through which a city's built past either is or is not considered official heritage and the consequences of such a designation. In parallel to seminar, once weekly labs introduce foundational competencies of historical GIS, with concentrations in a range of disciplines. In the spring of 26, from African diaspora studies to informatics and environmental engineering, students in the course possess varied degrees of familiarity with GIS, including none. The course is listed for upper-level undergraduates, though there are no prerequisites, and the description welcomes students with no background in GIS. The HGIS labs proceed in a scaffolded sequence from making the students making their first map in GIS. We build to georeferencing historic raster maps, visualizing vector data, creating vector data, especially from those georeferenced maps, and then analyzing change across space and over time. While learning GIS is key to these labs, inquiry is also a central goal. Or stated differently, the questions that arise in the course of historical mapping are as valuable as the conclusions that we draw. For example, the first substantial assignment is to create a map of Sao Paulo with the following elements: the city's street grid, building footprints, district boundaries, points of significant demolitions we would study in seminars, polygons of sites that have an official heritage designation, pictured here in red, and polygons of expropriated areas, pictured here in blue. This exercise helps to build competencies in map making and provides greater orientation for students to the geography of the city as a whole, which was unfamiliar to most of them, as well as the specific locations of the demolitions we study in depth during seminar. At the same time, one of the curious, counterintuitive relationships we discerned in mapping these data sets were spaces where heritage and expropriation polygons overlapped. One of the seemingly highest concentrations of this phenomenon, in fact, took place in one of our case study areas, a section of the city's historic Luz neighborhood. Home to the city's largest open-air drug market, as well as some of the city's most esteemed cultural institutions, the region has been a persistent focus of public health campaigns, police operations, and efforts at, quote, culture-led urban regeneration. While we did not have time to investigate the history of expropriation and preservation, the overlapping history of those two here in greater depth, the exercise introduced a compelling new research question to examine in future iterations of the course. We pursue similar inquiry in the second section of the term centered on Austin. Here, our work with HGIS includes more intermediate techniques of visualization and data management, using that data set of 14,000 demolition permits from the city of Austin from 2010 to 25. A heat map of those demolitions is shown here, and the students were charged to create heat maps of demolitions with this data set in 5-year periods, and then to seek out patterns of change and continuity over time. In addition, inspired by the work of John Clary, who authored the project, data visualization project Spatial Austin, we began to conduct a proximity analysis of demolitions and affordable housing units in the city. Again, the goal here is to pursue open and collaborative inquiry, understanding what kinds of questions we can ask with spatial data over time. Let me highlight a few of the typical challenges encountered in the GIS portion of the course. The first is platform selection. Before this past spring, I opted for Esri's ArcGIS Pro, which requires a license and is restricted to PCs. In the spring of 26, we used the open source alternative QGIS. Doing so enabled non-PC users to work on mapping labs outside of the lab time and ensured that students would be developing proficiencies in a platform they could continue to use following graduation, when they may no longer have access to a university license. Another challenge concerned data management. Cloud-based storage was the obvious and natural choice for sharing geospatial data. However, accessing that data in our computer lab required multiple stages of credential entry, verification, and inevitably password troubleshooting. We saved precious time in labs by reverting to USB drives, which students preloaded with data before class. Lastly, background and learning pace. Students not only arrive with different levels of GIS experience, they also acquire GIS competencies at different speeds, which itself can vary throughout the term. The small size of this course at 10 in the spring of 26 allowed for consistent and individualized support to position students for success. Now, Demolitions focused HGIS, especially for transnational comparative urban history and cities of the global south like Sao Paulo, also presents somewhat more particular challenges. For example, the challenge of the language barrier surfaced especially and somewhat surprisingly in the GIS portion of this course. No students in this course spoke Portuguese. While I had selected English language sources for seminars focused on Sao Paulo, the sources encountered in GIS labs, the toponymy of the city, metadata about shapefiles, for example, were in Portuguese. Again, the small class size and accessibility of translation tools enabled students to navigate this difficulty with relative ease. Secondly, source availability. For 20th century Austin, researchers can access a robust collection of georeferenced historical maps and satellite imagery, historical vector data sets, and in some cases, readily available documentation of official city plans. Sources for mid-20th century Sao Paulo are, by contrast, much less accessible. The city's geospatial data portal, GeoSampa, provides access to some georeferenced historical base maps and satellite imagery, as well as some vector datasets. For more granular analysis of specific projects, however, sources are not easily accessible. Lastly, street renumbering and renaming. Changes to street addresses and names present another challenge, as contemporary geolocation services do not account for renaming and renumbering, and thus can generate inaccurate historic location results. This is not a problem unique to São Paulo and Austin, of course. However, researchers studying populous U.S. cities like Austin benefit from more robust historical source material, especially the Sanborn fire insurance maps, that can allow them to account for these changes. No comparable source base exists for São Paulo. Despite these typical and HGIS specific challenges, multiple students in the spring of 2026 reported learning GIS as both the most difficult and rewarding part of the course. Part of the reason for this response, I surmise, lies in our approach to HGIS as open and collaborative critical inquiry. Students applied their newfound HGIS competencies during the semester to original, collective, and individual research projects. One of our collective projects is a contribution to the collaborative historical mapping platform Pauliceia 2.0, a project based at the Federal University of São Paulo and involving partnerships with institutions throughout Brazil and the United States. Currently in its beta release, the platform contains 7 georeferenced historical maps of São Paulo, along with numerous layers of vector data authored by contemporary researchers and about a range of topics, from significant Catholic churches and the former streetcar network to sites of visiting circuses and disease outbreaks. In addition, Pauliceia 2.0 offers a custom geolocation tool that can approximate historical addresses, a key contribution of this project that has potential applicability for researchers studying comparable cities worldwide. Reflecting the project's alignment with the principles of open science, the underlying architecture of the platform and the geolocation tool are openly and freely available. In the spring of 2026, our contribution to Pauliceia 2.0 centered on São Paulo's Paulista Avenue, one of the city's most significant cultural, commercial, and civic spaces. Following the allotment of the avenue in the 1890s, some of São Paulo's wealthiest families constructed mansions in an array of ornate, at times lavish architectural styles along this grand tree-lined street. In the 1950s, however, Paulista became the focus of commercial development, and mansions were demolished or began to be demolished to make way for the construction of high-rise buildings. In decades following, preservationists attempted to save the buildings from demolitions, including through proposals to designate them officially as heritage. Some property owners, however, sought to capitalize on the commercial development by selling or developing their properties and therefore resisted preservation efforts. In surely the most dramatic example of resistance from 1989, owners of the Matarazzo mansion coordinated the detonation of explosives inside their residence, an incident covered in the article here from O Estado de São Paulo, one of the city's major and country's major newspapers. The damage to the Matarazzo mansion invalidated its heritage designation. 5 of the original mansions on Avenida Paulista remain standing today. Students in mapping urban destruction selected demolished mansions of interest, georeferenced historic maps of Paulista Avenue, and created polygons of the demolished buildings' footprints. They also added attribute data with information like the years the building was constructed and demolished, property owners' names, and a short description. We will upload the shapefiles of demolished mansions to Pauliceia 2.0, a contribution to our understanding of a dramatic chapter in the history of heritage and demolition in São Paulo. In addition to this collective research, students conclude the term with an individual project concentrated on a demolished space of their choosing. They locate sources that provide context for the circumstances that led to and consequences of the demolition. They create 3 maps that include georeference sheets and the demolition footprint, and they also pitch a proposal for how the space should be reconstructed, an exercise in creative imagination that requires consideration of the significance of the place and its demolition, along with current urban dynamics. Students' final projects range again from the familiar to the unexpected. For example, one project this past spring charted the demolition of the broad grassy medians along Austin's former East Avenue, pictured here on the left, which were demolished for the construction of Interstate 35 or I-35, pictured here on the right. These medians served as a significant community space for the surrounding neighborhoods. Austin's Houston Tillotson, a historically black college, for instance, held its graduation ceremony on these medians. This history of medians as lost urban heritage again illustrates the surprising and fascinating dynamics that inquiry about demolitions has consistently yielded in the various iterations of this course. I'll close with 3 takeaways. Investigating and remapping demolished places in the built environment contributes to the historiography of cities like São Paulo, Austin, and Chicago. Such contributions are especially meaningful in surfacing the circumstances and consequences about a demolition that were not known widely or in some cases known at all. Second, for students in particular, this course prompts a critical understanding of recurring patterns, particularities, and unexpected dynamics in how cities change over time. For some, it can also prompt a deeper understanding of and a felt sense of connection to the surrounding campus and city. Lastly, this practice of excavation and reconstruction can also have a productive prospective dimension as a means for future preservation efforts, to illuminate how contemporary sociospatial dynamics developed, and as a resource for collectively imagining urban futures.